The early morning sunlight filtered through the manicured hedges of Oak Ridge Drive, casting long shadows across one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods. Devora Dev Wilson maintained her steady pace as she completed mile 3 of her morning run, her breathing controlled, her form impeccable. At 45, the founder and CEO of Horizon Technologies still prioritized these solitary moments before the demands of leading a multi-billion-dollar company consumed her day. Dev's athletic build moved with purpose beneath her understated athleisure wear. Despite her simple attire, or perhaps because of its deliberate simplicity, there was an unmistakable air of quiet confidence in her stride. Her running watch occasionally caught the morning light, a subtle reminder of how she measured progress in all aspects of her life, with precision, data, and unwavering consistency. Mile 3, heart rate steady, she thought to herself as her feet rhythmically struck the pavement. Just like business, consistency wins. As she ran past the stately homes with their pristine lawns, Dev noticed the varied reactions from early rising neighbors. Some offered friendly waves, acknowledging her familiar presence after 3 years in the community. Others averted their gaze, their discomfort at her presence never fully concealed despite her prominence. Dev had long ago learned to navigate these waters with grace, focusing instead on the sanctuary she had built for herself in this exclusive enclave. Her wireless earbuds pulsed with gentle rhythm as she slowed to a cooling walk, checking the metrics on her watch. When her phone rang, she answered it with the same professional warmth she'd become known for in boardrooms across 4 continents. "Wilson," she answered, her voice steady despite her recent exertion. "Yes, I can make that call before the market opens." She listened intently to her CFO's update on their Asian expansion, nodding with satisfaction. The Shanghai numbers look promising. Let's move forward with the expansion. As she continued her conversation, Dev's peripheral vision caught sight of a patrol car cruising slowly down the street. Officer Craig Bennett watched her with an intensity that transcended routine surveillance. Dev had experienced that look enough times in her life to recognize its meaning immediately. "Let me call you back in 5, she said, disconnecting as a patrol car pulled alongside her. "Good morning, ma'am." Officer Bennett called from his open window, his tone carrying that familiar edge of suspicion that made Dev's shoulders tense reflexively. "Good morning, officer," she replied, her voice measured, polite, but guarded. Bennett's eyes scanned her, assessing. "Mind if I ask what you're doing in this neighborhood?" The question landed exactly as intended, a subtle reminder that to some, she would always look out of place here, regardless of her achievements or the address on her property deed. "Just finishing my morning run," Dev replied, maintaining the delicate balance between asserting her right to exist in this space and avoiding unnecessary confrontation. "You live around here?" Bennett asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "Just up the street," Dev answered, gesturing vaguely toward her home, a modern architectural masterpiece featured in last year's Architectural Digest. She deliberately omitted this detail, knowing from experience that offering too much information often came across as defensive, which could escalate rather than defuse. Bennett's expression hardened. "I haven't seen you before. Can I see some ID?" The familiar weight of these interactions settled onto Dev's shoulders, the burden of constantly proving one's belonging. "I don't carry ID when I run, but I've lived on Oak Ridge Drive for 3 years. Bennett exited his vehicle, his posture stiffening. "Ma'am, when an officer asks for identification, you need to comply." Dev took a measured breath, recognizing the situation unfolding before her, one she had navigated since childhood, through college at Princeton, through Harvard Business School, through boardrooms and venture capital meetings. The context changed, but the underlying dynamic remained painfully consistent. "I understand you're doing your job," she responded, her voice betraying none of the complex emotions churning beneath her composed exterior. "But I'm simply exercising in my own neighborhood." "This is a high-value neighborhood," Bennett countered, his hand resting on his belt. "We've had recent reports of suspicious activity." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Dev felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she asked, "And you believe I'm suspicious because—" Bennett didn't answer directly, but his narrowed eyes spoke volumes. "Step away from the sidewalk. Hands where I can see them." Dev raised her hands slightly, maintaining her dignity even as she complied. The indignity of the situation was all too familiar. The same indignity she had faced the day after closing her first $1 million funding round, the same day her company went public, the same week she had donated $10 million to the city's education foundation. "Officer, I'm the CEO of Horizon Technologies. I'm on my morning run. This is unnecessary," she stated, not as a plea but as a simple fact. Across the street, Margaretchen slowed her pace, her small Shih Tzu tugging against his leash as a retired judge observed the interaction with growing concern. At 65, Margaret had presided over enough cases to recognize an abuse of authority when she saw one. Bennett's dismissive response cut through the morning air. "Right, and I'm the president. Step over here now." Dev's legal training from her early career surfaced. "I'm going to reach for my phone to call my lawyer." "Don't touch anything," Bennett suddenly shouted, moving toward her with alarming aggression. Dev instinctively stepped back, her heart rate spiking in a way her morning run had never triggered. Within seconds, Bennett grabbed her arm with unnecessary force, causing her to wince. "You're hurting me," Dev stated, her voice steady despite the pain shooting through her shoulder. "This is completely unwarranted." Bennett twisted her arm behind her back, pushing her toward his cruiser with a force that belied any legitimate law enforcement purpose. "Stop resisting," he commanded. "I am not resisting," Dev replied through gritted teeth, the absurdity of the accusation compounding the injustice of the moment. As Margaret raised her phone to record the interaction, a black SUV with tinted windows slowed near the scene. The back window lowered silently, revealing Senator James Reynolds, chairman of the Police Oversight Committee. His expression hardened as he observed the officer's treatment of a woman he immediately recognized from her testimony before his committee just last month. "Stop the car," the senator instructed his driver, his voice carrying the weight of his considerable authority. Meanwhile, Bennett roughly pushed Dev against a patrol car, forcing her into a search position with a kick to separate her feet. Despite the physical and psychological assault on her dignity, Dev maintained her composure, a skill honed through decades of being the only black woman in countless rooms of power. "Officer, you are making a serious mistake," she stated, her voice carrying the quiet certainty that helped her navigate a world designed to exclude people who looked like her. "Sure I am. Everyone's innocent, right?" Bennett responded with condescension dripping from every syllable. From across the street, Margaret's voice cut through the tension. "I'm recording this, officer." Bennett glanced over, irritation flashing across his face. "Mind your business, ma'am." "This is my business," Margaret countered, her judicial authority evident in her tone. "I'm Margaretchen, retired Superior Court judge, and you just assaulted Devorah Wilson, the founder of Horizon Technologies and one of the largest philanthropic donors to the city's education system." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Bennett's face, but his grip on Dev remained firm until another voice joined the fray. "Officer, I believe you need to release Ms. Wilson immediately," Senator Reynolds called as he approached from behind. Bennett turned, recognition dawning instantly. As Senator Reynolds, "I'm curious what probable cause you have for detaining one of our nation's most successful entrepreneurs," Reynolds asked, his calm voice belying the anger evident in his eyes. "The same entrepreneur who, coincidentally, recently testified before my Committee on Technology Innovation." Despite her compromised position, Dev made eye contact with the senator. "Good morning, Senator. Not exactly how I plan to start my day." "Ms. Wilson," Reynolds acknowledged with respect, "I apologize for this inappropriate welcome to your morning." As Bennett slowly released his grip, Dev straightened her running jacket with quiet dignity, refusing to give in to the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her professional composure. "Officer," she addressed Bennett directly, her voice steady despite everything. I understand community safety is important, but safety must extend to everyone in the community. Bennett stood frozen, unable to respond as Margaret continued recording, adding, "This isn't an isolated incident. I've seen this happen before in this neighborhood." More neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Bennett's radio crackled with his dispatcher's voice. "Unit 47, what's your status?" Dev regarded the officer with a composed gaze that carried the weight of countless similar encounters throughout her life. "Your dispatcher is waiting," she reminded him quietly. In that moment, on a quiet suburban street bathed in early morning light, the vast machinery of systemic inequality was laid bare. Not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality that even wealth, fame, and achievement couldn't fully shield against. And yet, in Dev's unwavering dignity, there remained a silent testament to the resilience forged through decades of navigating a world not designed for her success. In the tense silence that followed, Dev became acutely aware of the growing crowd of neighbors gathering on perfectly manicured lawns. Some watched with genuine concern, others with the uncomfortable fascination of witnessing someone else's humiliation. A few had their phones raised, capturing the moment when a black woman's morning routine became an unwitting piece of social commentary. Officer Bennett's radio crackled again. "Unit 47, please respond." His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it, his eyes never leaving Senator Reynolds. "Unit 47 responding. Situation under control." The lie hung in the air between them. Nothing about the situation was under control, least of all Bennett's own grasp on the rapidly shifting power dynamics. Dev rolled her shoulders gently, working out the ache where Bennett had wrenched her arm. She'd experienced enough of these encounters to know that the physical pain would fade far sooner than the emotional aftershocks. Still, she maintained her composure, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "Officer Bennett," Senator Reynolds spoke, his voice carrying the weight of his committee chairmanship, "I believe we need to discuss what just happened here." Bennett's posture stiffened further. "Sir, I was responding to suspicious activity reports in the area." "Suspicious activity," Margaret echoed from across the street, her judicial authority evident in her tone. "Would you care to elaborate on what specific suspicious activity Ms. Wilson was engaged in?" "Running while black doesn't qualify, last I checked." Several neighbors murmured in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding their watches or phones fascinating. Dev observed the scene with the analytical mind that had built her technology empire. Every interaction, every microexpression told a story about the community she'd chosen to call home, a community where her presence still registered as an anomaly to some, despite her name appearing regularly on donor walls and business magazines. "May I?" Dev asked, looking directly at Senator Reynolds. When he nodded, she turned to address the gathering crowd. "I appreciate everyone's concern," she began, her voice carrying the same measured authority that had commanded boardrooms and investor meetings. "What happened here this morning is unfortunate, but not unfamiliar." She paused, noting how some neighbors avoided her gaze, while others met it with newfound recognition. "I run this route 3 times a week. I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years. Yet this is the 4th time I've been stopped by police while simply existing in my own community." The revelation rippled through the gathered onlookers. A woman in designer yoga wear gasped audibly. "For times?" Reynolds asked, his political instincts immediately calculating the implications. "For documented times," Dev clarified. "I've installed cameras outside my home that have captured previous incidents. My security team maintains records of all such encounters." Bennett's face flushed, the implication of potential previous misconduct by his colleagues, or perhaps himself, hitting home. "Ms. Wilson," he began, his tone suddenly formal, "there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding, Officer Bennett," Dev interrupted with quiet dignity. "What happened here was perfectly clear to everyone present." She turned to face him directly, her gaze steady. "What's less clear is what happens next. Not just today, but tomorrow and the day after, when I continue my morning runs. What happens when my 16-year-old nephew comes to visit next month? Will he be afforded the same protection of presumed innocence that other residents enjoy? The questions hung in the air, uncomfortable but necessary. Dev had long ago learned that true change rarely came from comfortable conversations. From across the street, Margaret approached, her small dog trotting beside her. "I believe what Ms. Wilson is articulating is a concept of disparate impact," she offered, her decades on the bench evident in her precise language. "When enforcement practices disproportionately affect certain community members, regardless of stated intent." Reynolds nodded, recognizing the legal framing. "Officer Bennett, I'd like your badge number and the name of your commanding officer." Bennett's professional demeanor crumbled further. "Sir, I was just following protocol for suspicious person reports." "And that," Dev interjected calmly, "is precisely the problem. When suspicious becomes code for different, the protocol itself becomes a mechanism for perpetuating inequality." A middle-aged man in an expensive-running outfit stepped forward from the crowd. Dev recognized him as Dr. Michael Harrington, chief of surgery at the University Hospital and her neighbor from 3 doors down. "I run this same route every morning at 5:30, he stated, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "I've never once been stopped, never questioned, never asked for ID." His gaze shifted between Dev and Bennett, the implication clear without being explicitly stated. What made her presence suspicious when his was not? Bennett's radio crackled again. "Unit 47, Captain Reeves requesting update." The mention of his superior officer seemed to snap Bennett back to the reality of his situation. He lifted the radio, his voice noticeably less confident. "Captain, I may need you at my location. We have a situation." As Bennett called in his captain, Dev checked her watch. The digital display showed 6:17 a.m., not even 7 hours since she'd woken up, and already the day had become another chapter in her ongoing navigation of spaces not designed with her in mind. Senator Reynolds approached her, speaking quietly. "Ms. Wilson, I want to personally apologize for this incident. As chairman of the Police Oversight Committee, I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated." Dev nodded, appreciating the sentiment while recognizing its limitations. "Thank you, Senator. But this isn't about one officer or one incident. It's about systems that continue to function exactly as they were designed to function." Reynolds' brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Officer Bennett is an anomaly," Dev explained. "He's a predictable outcome of a system that routinely labels some people as belonging and others as inherently suspicious." She gestured toward the gathering of neighbors, some of whom were now engaged in hushed conversations about what they'd witnessed. "Look around, Senator. How many of your constituents are just now realizing what their black neighbors experience as routine? How many police officers are taught to see threats instead of community members? These aren't accidents. They're features of system working as designed." Before Reynolds could respond, a second patrol car pulled up alongside Bennett's cruiser. Captain Diana Reeves, 50s, black woman, commanding presence, emerged, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had navigated complex racial dynamics throughout her career. "Officer Bennett," she called sharply. "Report." Bennett straightened instinctively. "Captain, I was responding to suspicious person reports in the area when he decided I was suspicious for jogging in my own neighborhood." Dev finished, her gaze level as she regarded the captain. Captain Reeves's expression remained neutral, but something flashed in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, of a struggle she knew intimately. "Ms. Wilson," she acknowledged with slight nod. "I believe we met at the Community Policing Initiative last year." "We did," Dev confirmed. "You spoke eloquently about building trust between officers and the communities they serve." The reminder hung between them, the current situation a stark counterpoint to those stated ideals. Captain Reeves turned to address the gathering crowd. "Folks, I appreciate your concern, but I need to ask you to disperse. We'll handle this matter internally." "With all due respect, Captain," Margaret interjected, holding up her phone, "what happened here shouldn't be handled just internally. I have video documentation of Officer Bennett's conduct." "As do I," added another neighbor, an older gentleman with professor's demeanor, "and I've already sent it to my daughter, who works at the post." The situation was rapidly evolving from an isolated incident to a potential media firestorm, a transformation Dev had seen countless times in the era of viral videos and social accountability. Captain Reeves assessed the situation with the tactical precision of someone who had risen through the ranks despite systemic barriers. Senator Reynolds, she acknowledged, I wasn't aware you were involved in this incident. I wasn't initially, Reynolds clarified. I was en route to a breakfast meeting when I witnessed Officer Bennett's interaction with Ms. Wilson. Reeves nodded, understanding the political dimensions now layered onto an already complex situation. Ms. Wilson, she addressed Dev directly, I'd like to speak with you privately about this incident, if you're willing. Dev considered the request, weighing her options. She had meetings scheduled beginning at 8 a.m., a quarterly board presentation at 10 o'clock, and a call with European investors at noon. Yet this moment, this opportunity to translate personal indignity into potential systemic change, felt too important to defer. I can give you 30 minutes, Captain, she agreed. But I'd prefer if Margaret joined us. Her judicial experience provides valuable perspective. Margaret nodded her acceptance, understanding her role as both witness and legal observer. As the impromptu meeting was being arranged, Dev noticed a young black woman watching from across the street. Unlike the other onlookers, she wasn't recording or gossiping. She was simply observing with an expression Dev recognized immediately, the look of someone seeing their own experiences validated in a public way. Dev made a mental note to find out who she was later. In that moment of silent recognition between them, Dev felt the weight of representation, the burden and the privilege of being visible in spaces where others like her remained unseen. Captain Reeves directed Bennett to wait in his patrol car while she spoke with Dev and Margaret. As he retreated, his earlier authority deflated, Dev was struck by how quickly power could shift when the right witnesses were present. She thought of all the identical encounters that occurred daily without senators or judges to intervene, without cameras to document, without the shield of wealth and status she possessed. Before we begin, Captain, Dev said as they moved toward a more private area of the street, I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not interested in punitive measures against Officer Bennett specifically. Reeves raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by this approach. Don't misunderstand, Dev continued. He should be held accountable for his actions today. But focusing solely on one officer's behavior misses the larger issue, which is, Reeves asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer, which is that what happened to me today is a symptom, not the disease, Dev replied. I'm more interested in addressing the systems that made this interaction possible, even predictable, than in seeing one officer disciplined while the underlying problems remain unchanged. As they settled onto a nearby bench for their discussion, Dev glanced back at the dispersing crowd of neighbors, some returning to their morning routines, others lingering to discuss what they'd witnessed. She wondered how many would truly internalize what they had seen, and how many would file it away as an unfortunate incident rather than a reflection of daily reality for so many. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Drive. Dev took a deep breath, centering herself for the conversation ahead. This was never how she had planned to spend her morning, but she had long ago learned that transformation rarely adhered to convenient scheduling. Let's begin, she said, her voice carrying the same steady authority that had built empires and broken barriers. We have much to discuss and limited time to do it. The three women sat in Captain Reeves' office at the precinct, the morning sun streaming through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across their faces. The stark fluorescent lighting combined with natural sunlight created an atmosphere of clinical scrutiny, fitting for the conversation that was unfolding. Dev Wilson sat with perfect posture, still in her running clothes, her presence transforming the utilitarian chair into something resembling a throne. Beside her, Margaret Chin maintained the observant silence of someone who had spent decades watching people reveal themselves through words and body language. Across the desk, Captain Diana Reeves reviewed the footage from Margaret's phone for the third time, her expression unreadable but her eyes missing nothing. This is clear misconduct, Reeves finally said, placing the phone carefully on her desk. Officer Bennett violated department protocols regarding reasonable suspicion and use of force. Dev nodded, acknowledging the statement without celebrating it. And yet, by certain metrics, he was simply doing what he was trained to do. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. Ms. Wilson, I understand your frustration, but our training explicitly prohibits racial profiling. On paper, Dev replied evenly. But when a suspicious person reports consistently describe people who look like me, and officers are trained to respond to those reports without questioning the biases behind them, the outcome is predictable. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Captain, how many suspicious person reports coming about white joggers in Oak Ridge? Reeves didn't answer immediately. The statistics obviously known to her, but politically complicated to acknowledge. Margaret filled the silence. When I presided over discrimination cases, I often found that the most damaging biases were never explicitly stated in policy, but embedded in seemingly neutral practices. Precisely, Dev agreed. Officer Bennett doesn't need to consciously harbor racial animus to participate in a system that produces racially disparate outcomes. Captain Reeves sighed, the sound carrying the weight of her unique position. A black woman responsible for upholding a system that she herself had likely been victimized by at various points in her career. What exactly are you looking for here, Ms. Wilson? Reeves asked directly. Disciplinary action against Bennett? A formal apology. Dev studied the captain's face, seeing beyond professional mask to the complexity beneath. Here was a woman who had likely fought many of the same battles Dev had fought, but within an institution resistant to fundamental change. What I want, Dev replied carefully, is transformation, not punishment. Officer Bennett is one individual operating within a much larger ecosystem. She reached into her running jacket and retrieved a small thumb drive, placing it on the desk between them. This contains 6 months of security footage from my home, showing every police interaction I've experienced in my neighborhood. It includes facial recognition data identifying 7 different officers from this precinct who have stopped me without cause. It also includes similar footage from 5 of my neighbors, all people of color, all professionals, all experiencing the same pattern of unwarranted stops. Captain Reeves stared at the thumb drive as if it might detonate. Dev continued, her tone measured but determined. I'm not interested in public embarrassment or individual retribution. What I want is structural change. What kind of structural change? Reeves asked, professional caution evident in her voice. I prepared a proposal, Dev replied. Horizon Technologies has developed analytics software that identifies patterns in enforcement practices. We've successfully implemented it in 3 cities already, resulting in a 40% reduction in biased policing incidents without compromising public safety. Margaret nodded appreciatively. I've reviewed the preliminary data from those implementations. The results are promising. Reeves picked up the thumb drive, turning it over in her hand. You want to use your company's software to monitor my officers? I want to partner with your department to create accountability systems at work. Dev corrected. The software doesn't just identify problems. It creates pathways for improvement. It offers officers real-time feedback and alternative intervention strategies. She paused, allowing her words to resonate. Captain, I believe you want the same things I want. A community where everyone is treated with dignity, where safety is universal rather than selective, where officers can do their jobs effectively without perpetuating harm. Reeves placed the thumb drive back on the desk, her expression thoughtful. You've clearly put considerable thought into this. I've had ample opportunity, Dev replied, a hint of weariness briefly cracking her composed exterior. This morning wasn't an isolated incident for me. It wasn't even the most egregious example I've experienced. For a moment, silence filled the office as all 3 women acknowledged the reality beneath the conversation. The accumulated weight of innumerable moments of degradation, suspicion, and dehumanization that constitute a parallel American experience. Margaret spoke first. When I was first appointed to the bench, a security guard stopped me from entering the judge's chambers. He assumed I was a defendant who had wandered into the wrong area. She smiled faintly at the memory. I had my robes in my hand. Reeves nodded, offering her own memory in return. My first week as a patrol officer, I was in uniform getting coffee. Another customer called 911 to report someone impersonating an officer. Dev absorbed these stories, These small tokens of shared experience offered as bridges across professional divisions. She thought her own collection of similar moments. Too numerous to count, too significant to forget. The first time I closed a major funding round, she contributed quietly, I arrived at the celebration dinner and was directed to the kitchen entrance. The three women shared a moment of silent recognition, the unspoken understanding that their exceptional achievements had never exempted them from the fundamental questioning of their belonging. Captain Reeves straightened some papers on her desk, a gesture that seemed to help her transition back to the professional matter at hand. Your proposal is intriguing, but implementing new systems requires budget approvals, union negotiations, departmental buy-in. It's not something I can authorize unilaterally. I understand bureaucratic constraints, Dev acknowledged. That's why I've already scheduled meetings with your police commissioner and the mayor for tomorrow morning. Reeves' eyebrows rose slightly. You work quickly. Necessity has made me efficient, Dev replied without arrogance. Senator Reynolds has also expressed interest in implementing our analytics system as part of a pilot program his committee is funding. Margaret smiled faintly. And the media attention from this morning's incident will create public pressure for meaningful response rather than symbolic gestures. The strategic landscape was becoming clear. Dev had transformed a moment of personal indignity into a carefully orchestrated campaign for structural reform, leveraging every resource at her disposal. Technological innovation, political connections, media visibility, and community alliance. What about Officer Bennett? Reeves asked, returning to the specific catalyst of their conversation. I'd like him to be part of the solution, Dev answered, surprising both women. Rather than facing traditional disciplinary measures, I propose he become one of the officers who helps implement the new program. You want to reward him? Reeves asked incredulously. I want to transform him, Dev corrected. Punishment reinforces defensiveness. Inclusion creates investment. Officer Bennett has an opportunity to become an advocate for change from within the department. Margaret nodded appreciatively. Restorative rather than punitive justice. Captain Reeves leaned back in her chair, studying Dev with newfound respect. You're not what I expected, Ms. Wilson. Most people who look like me have learned to be strategic beyond others' expectations, Dev replied. It's a survival skill that becomes a superpower when applied to systems change. Outside the captain's office, the precinct hummed with activity, officers filing reports, phones ringing, the machinery of law enforcement continuing its daily operations. Within the glass-walled space, however, something subtle but significant was shifting as three women from different spheres of influence found common purpose. I'll need to review your proposal thoroughly, Reeves said finally. And there will be resistance. Make no mistake about that. There always is, Dev acknowledged. But resistance is not the same as immovability. She checked her watch. A board meeting awaited her attention. Lives have been momentarily interrupted by this incident, but empires still required tending. I should go, she said, rising from her chair with fluid grace. My assistant has emailed you the complete proposal, along with contact information for the implementation team. As Deb prepared to leave, her phone chimed with an incoming message. The screen displayed a news alert. Tech billionaire allegedly racially profiled in elite neighborhood. The story was already spreading, pixels and algorithms carrying this morning's confrontation far beyond Oak Ridge Drive. Dev showed the screen to Captain Reeves. It begins, she said simply. Reeves nodded, understanding the implications. Once it's public, the pressure for immediate action intensifies, which is why having a substantive proposal already prepared matters, Dev replied. Empty gestures and performative apologies won't suffice when there's a viable alternative already on the table. Margaret stood as well, gathering her belongings. I'll make myself available to the implementation team as an advisor. My judicial experience might help navigate some of the legal complexities. As they prepared to part ways, Captain Reeves rose from behind her desk, extending her hand to Dev. The gesture was professional but carried an undercurrent of something more personal. Recognition, perhaps, or solidarity. Ms. Wilson, she said as they shook hands, may I ask you something that's not strictly related to this morning's incident? Dev nodded her permission. How do you do it? Reeves asked, her professional facade momentarily giving way to genuine curiosity. Maintain such composure in these situations? I've been in law enforcement for 27 years, and I still find myself struggling with the emotions these encounters trigger. Dev considered the question, understanding its depth and the vulnerability required to ask it. I don't always maintain composure, she admitted quietly. There are moments when the accumulated weight becomes too much. Moments in private when the armor comes off. She glanced out the glass walls of the office to the bustling precinct beyond, where officers went about their duties, unaware of the conversation unfolding mere feet away. But I've learned that my emotional reaction is often weaponized against me, she continued. So I've developed what I call strategic composure. Not because I don't feel, but because my goals require emotional discipline. Reeves nodded slowly, recognition flickering in her eyes. The double burden. Exactly, Dev confirmed. We're required to experience the indignity while simultaneously managing the emotional comfort of those inflicting it. Margaret joined the conversation. When I was on the bench, defendants would often tell me I didn't seem black because of my formal manner of speaking, as if articulation and blackness were somehow incompatible. The three women shared another moment of unspoken understanding. The exhausting navigation of others' expectations and stereotypes, the constant calibration of self-presentation. What we're really talking about, Dev said softly, is the prerequisite dignity tax. Pardon? Reeves asked. The extra price we pay just to enter spaces others access freely, Dev explained. The constant proving and reproving of our worthiness to exist unchallenged in our own neighborhoods, our own workplaces, our own skin. She straightened her running jacket, preparing to step back into the world and all its complex negotiations, which is precisely why this isn't about Officer Bennett. It's about dismantling systems that demand that tax from some while exempting others. As they prepared to leave the office, Dev's phone chimed again, a reminder of her board meeting now just 40 minutes away. The momentary bubble of shared understanding would soon give way to the demanding rhythm of her professional obligations. Yet something significant had transpired in this fluorescent lit space. Connections forged, alliances formed, possibilities opened. I'll be in touch, Captain, Dev said as they reached the precinct lobby. I look forward to working with you on implementation. As Dev stepped back into the morning sunlight, now fully risen over the city, she felt a familiar weight of visibility settling onto her shoulders. Passers-by glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with a vague recognition that comes from seeing someone familiar but not immediately placeable. She pulled out her phone to call her driver, noticing 3 missed calls from her chief of staff and several text messages asking if she was okay. The news had clearly reached her team. As she waited for a car, Deb composed a brief message to her executive team. Meeting delayed 30 minutes. Preparing strategic response to this morning's incident. Will brief everyone upon arrival. The black Tesla pulled up silently to the curb. As Dev settled into back seat, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window, still in running clothes, hair slightly disheveled, yet radiating an unmistakable authority. The dissonance was striking. Her external appearance at odds with her power, much like the dissonance Officer Bennett had experienced when confronting someone who defied his expectations. To the office, Ms. Wilson, her driver asked. Yes, she confirmed. But first, make a quick stop at home. I need to change. As the car pulled away from the precinct, Dev looked back to see Captain Reeves watching her departure from the entrance steps. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the work ahead, the systems to be dismantled, the transformations to be navigated. Deb turned her attention to her phone, beginning to draft a press statement that would shape the public narrative around the morning's events. The words flowed easily, transforming personal indignity into structural analysis, individual humiliation into collective opportunity. This was the alchemy she had mastered through necessity, converting pain into purpose, obstacles into openings, confrontation into constructive change. It wasn't easy, it never had been, but it was necessary. And necessity, as she often reminded her team, was the mother of transformation. 3 months after that fateful morning run, Dev stood at the podium in City Hall's Grand Assembly Room, the weight of expectant gazes upon her. The room buzzed with an unusual blend of energies. Police officers in uniform seated alongside community activists, tech industry leaders next to neighborhood residents from Oak Ridge Drive and beyond. Captain Reeves sat in the front row beside Senator Reynolds, their unlikely alliance a visual testament to the bridges that had been built in the aftermath of conflict. Today marks not an ending, but beginning, Deb began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the space. 3 months ago, an incident that has become all too familiar for many Americans became the catalyst for something unprecedented in our city. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long beams across the assembled crowd. Deb noticed Officer Bennett among the officers, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive, a transformation she wouldn't have predicted on that tense morning when he had pushed her against his patrol car. The community safety partnership we launched today represents a fundamental reimagining of what public safety means, she continued. Not safety for some at the expense of others, but collective well-being rooted in dignity and mutual respect. From her vantage point at the podium, Dev could see the faces of those whose lives had intersected with hers in ways both painful and transformative. Margaret Chin sat with quiet dignity, her judicial experience having shaped key elements of the oversight framework. The young black woman Dev had noticed watching from across the street that morning, who she now knew as Layla Washington, a brilliant doctoral student in public policy, had joined the implementation team, bringing both academic expertise and lived experience to the project. When systems fail us, Dev said, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd, we have 3 choices. We can accept that failure is inevitable, we can tear down without rebuilding, or we can transform what exists into what should be. She paused, allowing the words to resonate. Transformation is rarely comfortable. It requires honesty about where we've been and courage about where we need to go. It demands that we see problems not as individual failings, but as systemic patterns we have both the responsibility and the capacity to change. In the months following the incident, the video had indeed gone viral, garnering millions of views and igniting renewed conversations about racial profiling in affluent communities. But unlike so many similar incidents that flared in public consciousness only to be replaced by the next outrage, this one had become a fulcrum for substantive change. Dev had leveraged her technological expertise, financial resources, and growing public platform to create something entirely new, a comprehensive police community partnership that integrated Horizon's analytics, software with community oversight, officer training, and policy reform. The pilot program, initially met with skepticism from police unions and some community members alike, had shown promising early results. What makes this initiative different, Dev explained, is that it's built on the understanding that true safety emerges when everyone's dignity remains intact. When an officer approaches a community member, when a resident calls for help, when neighbors interact across lines of difference, dignity must be the foundation. She gestured toward the large screen behind her, where data visualizations illustrated the first 2 months of the program's implementation. Stops without reasonable suspicion had decreased by 47%. Officer commendations had increased by 33%. Community satisfaction with police interactions had improved across all demographic groups, with the most significant gains among communities of color. These numbers tell a story, Dev continued, but not the whole story. Behind each percentage point are human experiences, moments where someone felt seen rather than suspected, protected rather than policed, respected rather than restrained. Captain Reeves nodded subtly from her seat, their shared vision coming to life in measurable impact. I want to acknowledge something important, Dev said, her tone shifting slightly. The transformation we're witnessing didn't begin with me or with what happened that morning. It builds upon decades of work by community organizers, civil rights advocates, reform-minded officers, and everyday citizens who refuse to accept the status quo. She gestured towards several community leaders seated throughout the room, longtime advocates whose persistent demands for change had often gone unheeded until a viral moment created an opening for their expertise to be valued. What my experience provided was not the blueprint, but the catalyst, a highly visible example of what happens daily in communities across our city, often without witnesses, without cameras, without the protection that privilege affords. Dev thought back to the hours and days following the incident, the media requests, the public outrage, the calls for Officer Bennett's termination that had flooded social media. She had declined most interviews, redirecting attention instead to the structural reforms she was proposing. Her approach had surprised many, particularly those who expected her to leverage her platform for personal vindication rather than collective transformation. But Dev had long understood something essential about systems change. Making an example of one individual rarely transformed conditions that produced their behavior. I'd like to tell you about someone who embodies the transformative potential of this initiative, Dev said, her gaze finding Officer Bennett in the crowd. 3 months ago, Officer Craig Bennett and I had an encounter that could have ended very differently. Bennett straightened slightly in his seat, conscious of the eyes now turning toward him. Today, Officer Bennett serves as one of our program's most effective trainers, helping fellow officers understand how implicit biases affect split-second decisions and teaching de-escalation techniques that preserve dignity on all sides. She hadn't planned to single him out, but something in his expression, a mixture of humility and determination, moved her to acknowledge the journey he'd undertaken. The easy path would have been punishment followed by mutual resentment. The harder but infinitely more valuable path has been transformation through accountability, education, and a commitment to doing better. Bennett nodded almost imperceptibly, accepting both the acknowledgement and the implicit challenge to continue the work. This is not a feel-good story, Dev clarified, her tone measured. It's a story about the difficult, necessary work of examining systems that fail us and rebuilding them with intention. It's about understanding that true justice isn't about punishment, but about creating conditions where harm becomes less likely, where dignity becomes the default, where belonging isn't determined by appearance or address. As she neared the conclusion of her remarks, Dev thought of the countless mornings she had jogged through Oak Ridge Drive since the incident, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by neighbors who had approached her afterward, offering both apologies for not intervening and commitments to greater awareness. She thought of the young children who now waved to her from driveways, the tentative community building that had emerged in the wake of confrontation, the difficult conversations that had begun in living rooms and community centers throughout the neighborhood. I run the same route every morning, Dev shared, allowing a hint of personal reflection to enter her professional presentation. Past the same homes, the same gardens, the same intersections. But something fundamental has shifted in those spaces. She paused, gathering her thoughts. It's not just that I encounter fewer suspicious glances, or that patrol cars no longer slow when they pass me. It's that there's a growing recognition that safety isn't measured by the absence of certain people, but by the presence of mutual respect. From the back of the room, Layla Washington caught Dev's eye and smiled. The connection between a reminder how representation echoed across generations, how visibility in one space created possibilities in countless others. The technology we developed at Horizon is important, Dev acknowledged, gesturing toward the analytics dashboard displayed behind her. Data helps us identify patterns, measure progress, and create accountability. But technology alone can't transform cultures of suspicion into cultures of belonging. She looked out at the assembled crowd, the unlikely coalition of stakeholders who had moved from skepticism to cautious collaboration over the preceding months. What transforms cultures is people willing to see differently, to question assumptions, to reimagine possibilities. It's officers like Captain Reeves who lead with both authority and empathy. It's judicial leaders like Margaret Chin who translate abstract principles into practical protections. It's community members who demand better, while remaining open to good faith efforts at change. Dev's gaze encompassed the entire room, acknowledging the collective effort represented there. And it's everyday citizens who refuse to accept that being treated with dignity should be a privilege rather than a right, who understand that true safety emerges only when everyone's humanity is recognized and respected. As she concluded her remarks and stepped away from the podium to sustain applause, Dev felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in what had been accomplished, awareness of how much remained to be done, and a deep appreciation for the unexpected community that had formed around this work. Senator Reynolds approached her first, shaking her hand firmly. "Remarkable progress, Ms. Wilson. My committee is already looking at expanding this program to 3 additional cities." Dev nodded her appreciation. The analytics framework is designed to be adaptable to different community contexts. My team is prepared to support those expansions, As others gathered around to offer congratulations and ask questions, Dev noticed Officer Bennett hanging back, seemingly unsure whether to approach. She excused herself from the growing circle of well-wishers and walked deliberately toward him. "Officer Bennett," she greeted him, extending her hand. He took it, his handshake firm but no longer domineering. "Ms. Wilson, that was generous of you to mention my involvement." "Not generous," Dev corrected gently. "Accurate. Your willingness to engage with the program rather than becoming defensive has been instrumental in bringing other officers on board." Bennett nodded, a complicated mix of emotions crossing his face. "I've been thinking a lot about that morning, about how quickly I made assumptions, how automatically I escalated the situation. And," Dev prompted, "and I'm starting to understand how much I didn't see. Not just about you, but about so many interactions throughout my career." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not asking for absolution. I just want you to know the work is changing me, not just my behavior on the job." Dev studied him, seeing beyond a uniform to the human complexity beneath. "That's the point, Officer Bennett. Sustainable change happens when we transform not just protocols but perspectives." As their conversation concluded and Bennett moved away to join his fellow officers, Layla approached, her expression thoughtful. "That couldn't have been easy," she observed, having witnessed the exchange. Dev sighed softly. "Few worthwhile things are. But holding space for transformation doesn't mean forgetting what necessitated it." Layla nodded, understanding the delicate balance Dev had been navigating these past months, being simultaneously the catalyst, the designer, and in many ways, the bridge between worlds that rarely communicate effectively. "What happens next?" Layla asked, after the speeches and the data presentations and the initial successes. It was a question that had occupied Dev's thoughts continuously. How to ensure that this moment of possibility didn't fade into forgotten promises and unrealized potential like so many reform efforts before it. "Next comes the hardest part," Dev admitted. "Sustaining momentum when the spotlight dims. Continuing the work when it's no longer headline news, but daily practice." She glanced around the room at the unlikely coalition that had formed: police and activists, tech experts and community elders, political leaders and ordinary citizens, all temporarily united by a shared vision, but vulnerable to the entropy that often eroded collective efforts over time. "That's why we built sustainability into the program structure," she continued, more to herself than to Layla. "Community oversight that doesn't depend on one person's influence. Funding mechanisms that can't be easily dismantled. Technology that creates transparency and accountability by default." As the formal program concluded and people began to disperse, Dev found herself standing with Margaret Chin near one of the tall windows overlooking the city. Below them stretched the urban landscape, neighborhoods of vastly different resources existing side by side, separated by invisible but powerful boundaries of opportunity and access. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "in 30 years on a bench, I saw countless attempts at reform. Most failed because they addressed symptoms rather than causes." Dev nodded, understanding the implicit question about whether this effort would be different. "What gives me hope," Margaret continued, "is that you've approached this not as a single-issue fix, but as a systems redesign. You've created structures that make doing the right thing easier than doing the wrong thing." "That's the essence of it," Dev agreed. "Sustainable change isn't about constantly overriding human nature through sheer force of will. It's about realigning systems so that our better instincts become the path of least resistance." As they stood in companionable silence, watching the city below, Dev's thoughts returned to that morning run 3 months earlier, how the simple act of exercise in her own neighborhood had unexpectedly catalyzed a cascade of transformations, both personal and systemic. She thought of all the mornings since when she had retraced those same steps, reclaiming the space not just for herself, but for all who had been made to feel they didn't belong. She thought of the neighbors who now joined her occasionally, the community that was slowly, imperfectly forming across lines of difference that had once seemed impermeable. And she thought of the young woman standing beside her at the window, whose dissertation research had been incorporated into the program's evaluation metrics, how representation created possibilities that extended far beyond individual achievement. "I ran this morning," Dev said quietly. The same route as always. Margaret turned to her, understanding the significance of this simple statement. A patrol car passed me near the park, Dev continued. The officer waved, not because he recognized me personally, but because that's the new protocol, acknowledgement rather than suspicion. She paused, reflecting on how something so small could represent something so profound. It's not about me being treated as an exception because I'm now recognized, she clarified. It's about changing the default response to everyone. Margaret nodded, understanding the distinction, from suspicious until proven legitimate, to community member until proven otherwise. Exactly, Dev confirmed. Dignity as the starting point, not the hard-won destination. As they prepared to leave the ceremony, Dev caught sight of a reflection in the window glass. No longer in running clothes, but in the professional attire of the CEO she was. Yet in either context, her fundamental humanity remained constant, a truth that systems of surveillance and control had repeatedly failed to honor. The work ahead remained substantial, the transformation incomplete. But in this moment, standing in the sunlight streaming through City Hall windows, Deb allowed herself to acknowledge what had already shifted. Not just policies and practices, but perspectives and possibilities. She had transformed a moment of personal indignity into a catalyst for collective change, not by diminishing the harm done, but by channeling it towards something constructive. She had built bridges where barriers had stood, created dialogue where silence or shouting had prevailed, and demonstrated that safety emerged not from control, but from connection. As she gathered her materials and prepared to return to the demanding rhythms of her professional life, Dev thought once more that morning run, of how the simple act of moving through space had never been simple for bodies marked as different. But she also thought of the future runs to come, and of the pathways being cleared, step by step, for all who would follow. Ready? Margaret asked, gathering her own belongings. Dev nodded, both in response to the immediate question and to the larger calling that had emerged from that fateful morning. Always, she replied, stepping forward into the light.